For nearly 200 years, Fort Henry has stood above the waters of the St. Lawrence, guarding against an enemy that would never appear. But contrary to local legend, the fort did serve in war. However, its massive walls did not keep the enemy out, but held them inside. Fort Henry stands on this point above what were the Royal Navy dockyards, where the Royal Military College of Canada now stands. It was meant to guard the conjunction of the Rideau Canal, the St. Lawrence River, and Lake Ontario from American forces. But with the threat of attack increasingly faint, the Great Fort was given a new purpose: holding prisoners of war. Among the first of these was Niels von Schultz, who would be the only man to hang within its walls. Niels was born in Finland in 1807. But at the tender age of 1, Russians invaded, forcing his family to flee to Sweden. Here, young Niels would be trained at a military academy and rise to the rank of warrant officer second class. But Niels, a poor judge of risk, was forced to resign his commission because of gambling debts. Seeking adventure, Niels fought for Polish liberation against the Russians and served with the French Foreign Legion in North Africa. Finally, disillusioned with army life, he established a laboratory hoping to invent a revolutionary manufacturing process. When his inventions failed, he accepted passage from a Swedish friend and made his way to the United States, where he at last found success, inventing a new way to extract salt from brine. But Niels had a wide, idealistic streak, and when the opportunity to fight injustice appeared, he leaped at the chance. After the failed rebellions of 1837, Canadian refugees and their American allies created secret societies called hunters' lodges. In clandestine meetings, they would preach the oppression of British rule in Canada and encourage freedom-loving Americans to liberate their northern neighbors. So, on the 11th of November, 1838, Niels von Schultz found himself on a schooner headed for Prescott, Ontario, to free Canadians from their oppressors. Niels and about 200 men made landfall near their target. But the rest of the men, including the commanders of the invasion, were unable to land. As the most experienced soldier, Niels suddenly found himself in command, holding out against waves of English soldiers while they awaited reinforcements and supplies. Finally, reduced to firing nails and hinges at the enemy, Niels was forced to surrender. The surviving invaders were taken to Fort Henry to await the judgment of a court-martial. Niels was defended by a young Kingston lawyer named John A. MacDonald. But Niels proved to be a difficult client for his ambitious defender, gallantly insisting that he should be punished for his misguided attack. And Niels was sentenced to death. As he was somehow understood to be a Polish soldier, it was decided Niels should be hung inside the fort while his troops would be hung at the local jail. So, at the age of 31, the life of Niels von Schultz, adventurer, gambler, and inventor, came to an end. The fort would not hold prisoners again until 1914. Shortly after the start of the First World War, the Canadian government issued the Proclamation Respecting Immigrants of German and Austro-Hungarian nationality. It allowed immigrants from these countries to be imprisoned if there was a possibility they would engage in espionage. So, more than 8,000 people who had thought of themselves as Canadian days before were labeled enemy aliens and sent to internment camps. The first permanent camp was Fort Henry. The camp commander, realizing his civilian charges had little to occupy their time, gave his prisoners the freedom to pursue their hobbies. To keep from falling into despair, the prisoners turned to woodwork, art, music, theater. They kept pets. One particularly keen German sailor had dogs, a tame muskrat, a snake, and when a local battalion abandoned their mascots, 2 trained bears. But by far the most popular pastime was escape. These 3 German POWs were tasked with fixing the commander's boat, which was anchored in Navy Bay. The 3 went to work and were watched over by an unarmed guard. After all, they drained the fuel tank before the repair, a fact no one had actually bothered to check. So, with a full fuel tank, the prisoners headed for the United States, dropping their guard off on an island along the way. The most bizarre escape occurred on the evening of August 23, 1916. At 5 o'clock, when the prisoners returned from working in the vegetable garden, the count was short by 2. The prisoners insisted that the 2 had escaped by boat, while the sentries swore that there had been no boats near the fort. Search parties scoured the grounds, but there was no trace of the missing prisoners. In fact, the escape plan had begun months earlier. A tall bed of corn had been planted to block the view from the guard towers, allowing the prisoners to dig freely in the tomato patch beyond, burying a box big enough to hold 2 men. When darkness fell, the 2 prisoners emerged from their hiding spot and made a run for it. After 2 days of avoiding search parties, the 2 stole a boat and rowed across the lake to freedom. In 1938, the fort got a new lease on life, restored and made into a living museum. Just a year later, the newly repaired walls would again hold prisoners of war. Perhaps the most lasting mark these prisoners left was this, the Heldenkeller, the Cellar of Heroes. And instrumental in its creation was U-boat Chief Engineer Gerhard Stamer. Stamer served aboard U-35. A career sailor, on his U-boat's first patrol, he had been given the Iron Cross for successfully repairing U-35 while it sat on the bottom of the sea. On its second patrol, the boat would not be so lucky. Surrounded by 3 English destroyers and damaged by depth charges, U-35 was forced to surface. Stamer was able to clear a jam in the ballast tanks and send the boat to the bottom of the sea, leaving the crew stranded in the cold Atlantic waters. But the English crews took pity on them, rescuing the stranded sailors. Every crew member from U-35 was saved, including 2 who couldn't swim. They were all shipped off to Canada and found themselves prisoners in Fort Henry. Here Stamer discovered a new talent, scrounging luxuries for his campmates, eventually convincing their captors that beer would make the sailors' captivity more bearable. The prisoners converted a casement into a beer cellar and painted murals to mark their treasure trove. A knight and a monk representing courage and wisdom. 2 knights locked in battle, reminding the prisoners to fight to the end, and a third showing a merchant convoy under attack, commemorating the sailors' contribution to the war. And so, the old casement became, for a time, a beer-laden hall of heroes. With the war over, Fort Henry returned to its pre-war purpose, making history come alive. The Fort Henry Guard, a group of well-trained university students, recreate the lives of 19th century soldiers and fire cannons that never saw war. The fort's true service is now commemorated in a few paintings, some artifacts, and the restless ghosts of its prisoners, now consigned to the City of Shadows.